Good evening. Tonight, we descend into the shadowed halls of ancient Greece, where marble statues stand silent, witness to stories that have been sanitized, romanticized, and stripped of their true horror. This is not the sanitized mythology you learned in school. This is the raw, unvarnished truth about the women who populated the ancient Greek imagination. Women whose fates were so brutal, so unjust, that their screams still echo through the corridors of time. From mortal maidens transformed into monsters, to goddesses whose own divine power could not protect them from suffering. We will explore the darkest corners of mythological misogyny, where beauty became a curse, love became a trap, and even the gods themselves were not immune to the cruel machinery of fate. Before we unravel these dark tales of suffering and survival, leave a comment telling me from which country you are watching and what time it is right now. Think of it as a modern tribute to the forgotten voices of these women, whose stories have been whispered across millennia. From ancient amphitheaters to your screen tonight. Chapter 1. The Curse of Beauty. In the ancient world, beauty was not a blessing. It was a death sentence waiting to be carried out by the gods themselves. The Greeks understood something that modern fairy tales have forgotten. To be beautiful as a woman was to paint a target on your back, to invite the attention of beings so powerful that their love could literally destroy you. Let us begin with Medusa, whose name has become synonymous with feminine rage and monstrous transformation. But before she became the serpent-haired creature whose gaze could turn men to stone, Medusa was a woman. More than that, she was a priestess in the temple of Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. She had taken vows of chastity, dedicating her life to serving the divine. Her beauty was legendary, her golden hair cascading like liquid sunlight, her eyes holding depths that could make poets weep and warriors lay down their arms. But beauty, in the Greek world, was an invitation to violation. Poseidon, god of the seas, brother to Zeus himself, saw Medusa in Athena's temple and was consumed with lust. He cared nothing for her vows, nothing for her sacred duty, nothing for the sanctity of his own niece's temple. In that holy place, where incense burned and prayers rose to the heavens, Poseidon raped Medusa. The marble floors, consecrated to wisdom and purity, were defiled by divine violence. And how did Athena, the goddess of wisdom, respond to this violation of her temple and her priestess? Did she punish her uncle, the rapist god who had desecrated her sacred space? Did she offer comfort to the traumatized woman who had served her faithfully? No. In a display of victim blaming that would make modern observers recoil, Athena turned her rage not on Poseidon but on Medusa herself. The goddess transformed the rape victim into a monster, her beautiful hair becoming writhing serpents, her lovely eyes becoming instruments of death. Think about the psychological horror of this transformation. Medusa woke one morning to find that her very existence had become a weapon she could not control. She could never again look upon another human being without killing them. She could never see her own reflection without risk. Love, companionship, even the simple pleasure of eye contact, all were stolen from her. She was banished to a cave, at the edge of the world, where she would spend her days surrounded by the stone corpses of those who had glimpsed her face. And yet, even in this monstrous form, Medusa found no peace. Heroes came to kill her, drawn by the fame that would come from slaying the terrible Gorgon. Perseus, backed by the gods themselves, would eventually succeed in cutting off her head, using her reflection in his shield to avoid her deadly gaze. But even in death, Medusa's suffering continued. Her severed head became a weapon, her image a symbol of feminine danger that men could brandish to terrify their enemies. The cruelest irony, from Medusa's blood, spilled when Perseus beheaded her, sprang Pegasus, the winged horse. Even in death, she was forced to give birth to something beautiful that would serve others. Her own beauty, once natural and pure, had been corrupted into something deadly, and even her death created beauty for others to claim. Medusa's story is not unique. It is a template, a pattern that repeats throughout Greek mythology with nauseating frequency. The woman is innocent, the god is guilty, and somehow, impossibly, it is the woman who pays the price. Consider Daphne, the Naiad who caught the attention of Apollo, god of music, poetry, and the sun itself. Daphne was a free spirit, a huntress who ran through the forests with her bow, dedicated to Artemis, goddess of the hunt and eternal virginity. She had no interest in love, no desire for marriage, no wish to be conquered or possessed. But Apollo, struck by Cupid's arrow, became obsessed with her. The pursuit that followed was not romantic. It was a hunt, with Apollo as the predator and Daphne as the prey. Through forests and meadows, over streams and rocky hills, the god chased the terrified nymph. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs shook with exhaustion, until she could feel his breath on her neck. And when she could run no more, when capture seemed inevitable, she made a choice that should horrify us. She chose to stop being human rather than submit to rape. Daphne's father, the river god Peneus, heard her desperate prayer and granted her wish. Just as Apollo's hands reached for her, her skin hardened into bark, her feet grew roots, her arms became branches, and her hair transformed into leaves. She became a laurel tree, forever rooted to one spot, forever silent, forever safe from Apollo's lust, but also forever denied the freedom she had cherished. And how did Apollo react to this transformation? Did he feel remorse for driving a woman to such desperate measures? Did he reflect on the horror of his pursuit? No, he declared the laurel tree sacred to himself, claiming that since he could not possess Daphne, he would at least possess her memory. He wove her leaves into a crown, making the symbol of her desperate escape into a trophy of his conquest. To this day, we crown our victors with laurel leaves, never remembering that we are celebrating the fossilized scream of a woman who chose to stop being human rather than endure rape. The pattern continues with Io, a priestess of Hera who caught the eye of Zeus, king of the gods. Zeus, never one to be denied, seduced or raped Io. We cannot be certain which, because the ancient sources are deliberately vague about consent when it comes to gods and mortals. But when Hera discovered the affair, her rage fell not on her unfaithful husband, but on the mortal woman who had been his victim. Hera transformed Io into a white heifer, stripping her of her human form and voice. But this was not enough for the jealous goddess. She sent a gadfly to torment Io constantly, stinging her and driving her to madness. The woman who had once served Hera faithfully was forced to wander the earth as a cow, unable to speak, unable to explain her innocence, unable to find peace anywhere. For months, Io wandered in her bovine form, driven mad by the constant stinging of the gadfly. She crossed seas and continents, always moving, never able to rest. When she finally encountered her father in Atreus, the river god could not recognize his own daughter. Io tried desperately to communicate, scratching letters in the dirt with her hoof, but even this simple act of writing was almost beyond her transformed capabilities. The psychological torture of this punishment is almost unbearable to contemplate. Io retained her human consciousness, but was trapped in an animal body. She could think and feel and remember what she had lost, but she could not speak, could not cry, could not even die to escape her torment. She was condemned to live as a beast, while her mind remained tragically human. Eventually, Zeus took pity on Io and restored her human form. But only after she had suffered for months, only after she had been driven nearly insane by her torment. And even then, her restoration came not from justice or mercy, but from Zeus's desire to end the inconvenience her suffering was causing him. Her pain was secondary to his comfort. These stories reveal a disturbing truth about Greek mythology. Women exist primarily as objects for male desire, and when that desire brings conflict, it is always the woman who pays the price. The gods, with their infinite power and their complete lack of accountability, could destroy mortal women on a whim, and there was no appeal, no justice, no higher court to which the victims could turn. But even among the gods themselves, the pattern held. Divine women were not immune to suffering simply because they possessed immortal power. Their stories, if anything, are even more tragic because their suffering was eternal. Their punishments lasting not years or decades, but forever. Chapter 2: The Prophetic Curse. Among all the cruel fates dealt to women in Greek mythology, perhaps none is more psychologically torturous than that of Cassandra, Princess of Troy. Here was a woman blessed with the gift of prophecy, cursed never to be believed, condemned to watch disaster after disaster unfold exactly as she had predicted, while being dismissed as a madwoman by those she tried to save. Cassandra's story begins with what the Greeks might have called a blessing. Apollo, god of prophecy and music, became infatuated with the young Trojan princess. Unlike his usual pattern of simply taking what he wanted, Apollo attempted to win Cassandra's affections through gifts. He offered her the most precious thing in his possession, the gift of prophecy, the ability to see the future as clearly as the present. For a moment, it seemed as though this might be a different kind of story. Here was a god offering genuine compensation for a woman's affections. Here was divine courtship rather than divine rape. Cassandra accepted the gift, and suddenly the future opened before her like a scroll unrolling. She could see the threads of fate weaving together, could watch the consequences of actions ripple forward through time. But when Apollo demanded payment for his gift, when he expected Cassandra to become his lover in return for her prophetic abilities, she refused. She had accepted the gift, but she had not agreed to become his possession. This was a distinction that Apollo could not tolerate. A woman who accepted his generosity but rejected his advances was an insult to his divine pride, and so Apollo devised a punishment that was as brilliant as it was cruel. He could not take back the gift of prophecy. Divine gifts once given could not be revoked, but he could corrupt it, twist it, make it into a source of infinite torment. With a kiss, Apollo cursed Cassandra so that while she would always speak the truth about the future, no one would ever believe her. Think about the exquisite torture of this curse. Cassandra could see disasters coming, could watch the threads of fate tightening around her loved ones, could perceive exactly how catastrophes could be avoided, but she was powerless to prevent them. Every warning she gave was dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman. Every prophecy she spoke was ignored, until it came true, at which point people would shake their heads and say, "How could we have known?" The psychological horror of Cassandra's situation becomes clear when we consider the fall of Troy. She saw it all: the Greeks hiding in the wooden horse, the destruction of her city, the death of her family, the enslavement of the Trojan women. She warned everyone, begged them to burn the horse, screamed that it was full of enemy soldiers. But the Trojans, convinced that she was insane, ignored her completely. They dragged the horse into their city and celebrated their supposed victory while Cassandra wept with the knowledge of what was coming. On the night Troy fell, Cassandra sought sanctuary in the temple of Athena, clinging to the statue of the goddess and begging for protection. But even in this sacred space, she found no safety. Ajax, the Lesser, driven by lust and the madness of war, raped her at the very feet of Athena's statue. The goddess, offended by this violation of her temple, would later punish Ajax, but in the moment she offered no protection to the prophetic princess who had served her faithfully. After Troy's fall, Cassandra was given as a prize to Agamemnon, the Greek king who had led the siege. She became his concubine, another trophy of war, to be used and discarded. But even as she was dragged away from her burning city, Cassandra could see what awaited her in Mycenae. She knew that Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, was planning to murder her husband in revenge for sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia to secure favorable winds for the Greek fleet. And she knew that she, Cassandra, would die alongside him, an innocent victim of a family's blood feud. When the ship carrying Agamemnon and his prizes arrived in Mycenae, Cassandra stood on the deck and spoke her final prophecy. She described in vivid detail how Clytemnestra would kill her husband in his bath, how she would die beside him, how the blood of both victims would stain the palace floors. The people listening dismissed her words as the usual ravings of the mad Trojan princess. Within hours, both Agamemnon and Cassandra were dead, just as she had predicted. But Cassandra's curse extended beyond her own death. She had seen the cycle of revenge that would follow, how Orestes, Agamemnon's son, would return to kill his mother in vengeance for his father's death, how the Furies would pursue him for matricide, how the blood would continue to flow from generation to generation. She had seen it all, and she had been powerless to stop any of it. The tragedy of Cassandra is not just that she died young, though that is tragic enough. It is that she lived her entire life knowing exactly how much suffering could be prevented if only people would listen to her, if only they would believe her warnings. She was condemned to be a witness to preventable disasters, a prophet whose prophecies served only to increase her own torment. In many ways, Cassandra's story is the ultimate expression of how Greek mythology viewed women's voices. Women could speak the truth, but they would not be believed. They could offer wisdom, but they would be dismissed as mad. They could see clearly, but they would be labeled as delusional. The curse that Apollo placed on Cassandra was simply an extreme version of the curse that patriarchal society placed on all women, the curse of not being heard. But Cassandra was not the only woman whose voice was silenced or corrupted by divine intervention. The story of Echo, the mountain nymph, reveals another dimension of how the gods punished women for daring to speak. Echo was a chatterbox, a nymph who loved conversation and storytelling. She had a gift for words, a talent for spinning tales that could hold listeners spellbound for hours. But she made the mistake of using her gift to help Zeus cover up his affairs. When Hera would come looking for her philandering husband, Echo would distract the goddess with long, entertaining stories, giving Zeus time to hide his lovers and return to his wife with an innocent expression. When Hera discovered this deception, she was furious. But as usual, her anger fell not on her unfaithful husband, but on the woman who had helped him. Hera cursed Echo, taking away her ability to speak original words. From that moment on, Echo could only repeat the last few words that others had spoken. Her gift for storytelling, her talent for conversation, her very voice all were stolen from her in a single moment of divine rage. The curse transformed Echo from a vibrant social creature into a tragic figure doomed to lurk in caves and forests, able only to repeat fragments of conversations she overheard. When she fell in love with Narcissus, the beautiful youth who could love no one but himself, she could not even tell him of her feelings. She could only echo his words back to him, a mockery of conversation that left both of them isolated and alone. Eventually, Echo wasted away from unrequited love, her body disappearing until only her voice remained, doomed to repeat the words of others for eternity. She became a phenomenon rather than a person, a sound rather than a woman. Her identity completely erased except for the one function that remained: the ability to echo. Echo's fate represents another aspect of how Greek mythology punished women for speaking. If they spoke too much, they were silenced. If they spoke the truth, they were cursed not to be believed. If they spoke at all, they risked divine punishment for the crime of having a voice. This pattern of silencing women's voices appears throughout Greek mythology in various forms. The sirens, those bird women whose songs could lure sailors to their deaths, were originally talented musicians who were transformed into monsters as punishment for challenging the muses to a singing contest. Their crime was not that they sang poorly, but that they sang too well, that they dared to compete with the divine sources of inspiration. The sirens' punishment was particularly cruel because it turned their greatest gift into a curse. They were condemned to sing forever, but their song became a trap rather than an art. They could attract listeners, but those listeners would die, leaving the sirens forever alone with their music. Their voices, once a source of joy and beauty, became instruments of death and isolation. These stories reveal a deep anxiety in Greek culture about women's voices and women's power to influence through speech. Whether it was prophecy, storytelling, or song, women's voices were seen as potentially dangerous, needing to be controlled or silenced. The gods served as enforcers of this silence, punishing women who spoke too much, too well, or too truly. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these stories is how they normalize the silencing of women. The curses are presented as justified punishments for crimes like helping Zeus commit adultery or refusing Apollo's advances. The narrative framework of Greek mythology makes it seem natural and inevitable that women who dare to speak would be punished, that their voices would be stolen or corrupted or made ineffective. Chapter 3: The Sacrificial Altar. In the pantheon of Greek tragedy, few stories are as heartbreaking as that of Iphigenia, daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. Her fate reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of how Greek mythology viewed women, as expendable resources to be sacrificed for male ambition and divine appeasement. The story begins with the gathering of the Greek fleet at Aulis, preparing to sail to Troy to retrieve Helen and restore Menelaus's honor. But the winds had died, leaving hundreds of ships becalmed in the harbor. Days passed, then weeks, and still the fleet could not sail. The soldiers grew restless, supplies ran low, and the great expedition that was meant to bring glory to Greece seemed doomed before it could begin. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and leader of the expedition, consulted the prophet Calchas to determine what had angered the gods. The answer that came back was devastating. Artemis, goddess of the hunt and protector of the innocent, was preventing the winds from blowing. She demanded a sacrifice, not of cattle or gold, but of human life. Specifically, she wanted Iphigenia, Agamemnon's eldest daughter, sacrificed on her altar. The reason for Artemis's anger varies depending on the version of the myth. Some say Agamemnon had boasted that he was a better hunter than the goddess herself. Others claim he had killed a sacred deer in her grove. But the exact cause matters less than the solution. Demanded the death of an innocent girl to appease divine wrath. Faced with this impossible choice, Agamemnon had to decide between his daughter's life and his duty as leader of the Greek expedition. Thousands of soldiers were depending on him. The honor of Greece was at stake, and the gods themselves had demanded this sacrifice. In the cruel mathematics of Greek heroism, the life of one girl, even his own daughter, was weighed against the glory of the entire expedition. But Agamemnon could not simply drag Iphigenia to the altar. She was safe at home in Mycenae, protected by her mother's fierce love. So he devised a deception that makes his crime even more heinous. He sent word to Clytemnestra that Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age, had asked for Iphigenia's hand. In marriage, the wedding was to take place at Aulis before the fleet departed for Troy. Imagine Clytemnestra's joy at this news. Her daughter was to marry the most famous hero of the age, a demigod whose name would echo through history. She prepared Iphigenia for the wedding, choosing the finest clothes, the most beautiful jewelry, coaching her in the rituals of marriage. The young girl, barely out of childhood, was excited to meet her famous bridegroom and to join the ranks. Of married women, the journey to Aulis must have been filled with anticipation and nervous excitement. Iphigenia would have asked countless questions about her future husband, about the wedding ceremony, about her new life as a hero's wife. Clytemnestra, unaware of the deception, would have shared her daughter's excitement, perhaps remembering her own wedding day and the hopes she had carried into marriage. When they arrived at Aulis, the truth began to emerge. Achilles, confused by their presence, revealed that he had made no proposal, that he knew nothing of any wedding. The joy in Iphigenia's eyes turned to confusion, then to fear, as she realized that something was terribly wrong. And when Agamemnon finally revealed the truth, when he explained that she had been brought to Aulis not as a bride, but as a sacrifice, the psychological horror of the situation became clear. The girl who had come expecting to celebrate her wedding day learned that she was to die instead. The father who had raised her, who had called her his precious daughter, was willing to kill her for the sake of his military ambitions. The marriage ceremony she had dreamed of was replaced by a sacrificial ritual that would end her life before it had truly begun. Different versions of the myth handle Iphigenia's response differently. In some, she begs for her life, clinging to her father and weeping. In others, she accepts her fate with noble resignation, declaring that she will die willingly for the good of Greece. But both versions are tragic in their own way. If she dies, weeping and terrified, we see a child murdered by her own father. If she dies nobly, we see a child so thoroughly indoctrinated into the values of a patriarchal society that she believes her death is justified. The most heartbreaking version is perhaps the one told by Euripides, where Iphigenia initially begs for her life, reminding Agamemnon of how she used to sit on his knee as a child, how she had been his favorite daughter, how she had always obeyed him and trusted him. But when she realizes that her pleas are useless, that her father's mind is made up, she transforms her terror into dignity. She declares that she will die willingly for Greece, that her sacrifice will bring victory and glory to the expedition. But even this noble transformation is tragic, because it represents the complete victory of patriarchal values over natural human bonds. Iphigenia has been so thoroughly trained to value male honor and military glory over her own life that she can convince herself that her murder is justified. She has internalized the values of a society that sees women as expendable, and she dies not just physically, but psychologically. As a victim of that society's priorities, the actual sacrifice is almost too horrible to contemplate. Iphigenia, dressed in her wedding clothes, was led to the altar where she expected to be married. Instead, she was bound and placed on the sacrificial stone. The knife that should have cut the wedding cake instead cut her throat. The celebration that should have marked the beginning of her adult life instead marked its end. But the story doesn't end with Iphigenia's death. The consequences of this sacrifice would ripple through the royal family for generations. Clytemnestra, mad with grief and rage, would spend the 10 years of the Trojan War planning her revenge. When Agamemnon finally returned home, victorious but laden with the blood of his daughter, she would murder him in his bath, striking him down with an axe while he was defenseless. The cycle of revenge that followed, Iphigenia's sacrifice, would consume the entire house of Atreus. Orestes, Agamemnon's son, would kill his mother to avenge his father. The Furies would pursue him for matricide. Brother would turn against sister, child against parent, in an endless spiral of violence that began with the decision to sacrifice one innocent girl for the sake of military glory. But Iphigenia's story is not unique in Greek mythology. The sacrifice of women and girls for male ambitions is a recurring theme that reveals the deeply disturbing values of the ancient Greek worldview. Consider the story of Polyxena, the youngest daughter of Priam, king of Troy. After the fall of Troy, when the Greek heroes were preparing to sail home with their spoils, the ghost of Achilles appeared to them with a demand. He wanted Polyxena, whom he had loved in life, to be sacrificed on his tomb so that her spirit could serve him in the afterlife. Polyxena, like Iphigenia, was an innocent victim of male ambition and divine demands. She had done nothing to deserve death, had committed no crime, had posed no threat to anyone. But her life was considered expendable, her death a fitting tribute to a dead hero's memory. The Greeks, who had just finished sacking Troy and enslaving its women, saw nothing wrong with adding one more murder to their list of war crimes. The parallels between Iphigenia and Polyxena are striking. Both were young women in the prime of life. Both were sacrificed by men who claimed to love them. Both died to satisfy the demands of supernatural beings who cared nothing for human life. Both were killed not because they had done anything wrong, but because their deaths were considered necessary for male honor and divine appeasement. These stories reveal a worldview in which women's lives had no intrinsic value, where daughters and wives and sisters could be murdered without consequence if their deaths served male purposes. The gods who demanded these sacrifices were not portrayed as evil or unusual, but as legitimate authorities whose demands must be obeyed. No matter how cruel or unjust, the psychological horror of these stories is compounded by the fact that they were told and retold by Greek audiences who saw nothing wrong with the basic premise. The sacrifice of women for male ambitions was not presented as a tragedy to be avoided, but as a noble deed to be celebrated. The fathers who killed their daughters were not villains, but heroes faced with difficult choices. The gods who demanded human sacrifice were not monsters, but legitimate authorities whose will must be obeyed. This normalization of violence against women is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these myths. They didn't just describe isolated incidents of cruelty, but reflected and reinforced a cultural worldview that saw women as expendable resources to be used and discarded at will. The stories of Iphigenia and Polyxena were not cautionary tales about the dangers of putting ambition before family, but examples of the difficult choices that heroes must sometimes make. Even when the myths acknowledged the tragic nature of these sacrifices, they did so in a way that ultimately justified them. The grief of mothers like Clytemnestra was portrayed as understandable but ultimately destructive, leading to cycles of revenge that hurt everyone involved. The message was clear: women's natural emotions, their love for their children, their desire for justice, were dangerous forces that needed to be controlled or suppressed. The altar where Iphigenia died was not just a place of sacrifice, but a symbol of the entire system of values that governed Greek society. It represented the principle that women's lives were worth less than men's honor, that daughters could be murdered for their father's ambitions, that the gods themselves endorsed and demanded the sacrifice of the innocent for the glory of the guilty, and perhaps most tragically, these altars are not just ancient history. The same logic that justified Iphigenia's sacrifice, the same prioritization of male honor over female life, the same willingness to use women as pawns in larger games of power and politics, continues to shape our world today. The names and faces change, but the fundamental pattern remains. Women's lives are expendable, their deaths are justified, and their voices are silenced by those who claim to love them. Chapter 4: The Cycle of Revenge. The women of the house of Atreus lived under a curse that stretched back generations, a curse that turned mothers into murderers and daughters into victims. Their story is one of the most psychologically complex and brutal in all of Greek mythology, revealing how trauma and injustice can corrupt even the most natural bonds between family members. The curse began with Tantalus, Agamemnon's great-grandfather, who committed the ultimate crime against the gods. He killed his own son, Pelops, cooked his flesh, and served it to the gods as a test of their omniscience. The gods, horrified by this act of filicide and cannibalism, brought Pelops back to life, but cursed Tantalus's bloodline forever. The sins of the father would be visited upon the children and the children's children, in an endless cycle of violence and revenge. By the time we reach Clytemnestra, the curse had already claimed multiple generations. She had grown up knowing that her family was doomed, that violence and betrayal were their inheritance. But nothing could have prepared her for the choice that Agamemnon would force upon her: to watch her eldest daughter die or to lose her husband to the winds of war. When Agamemnon deceived Clytemnestra into bringing Iphigenia to Aulis, he did more than betray his wife's trust. He destroyed the fundamental bond between them, the sacred covenant that marriage was supposed to represent. A husband who could lie to his wife about their daughter's fate, who could use their child as a pawn, in his political games, was no longer a husband at all. He was an enemy wearing the mask of a lover. The moment Iphigenia's blood hit the altar, Clytemnestra's heart hardened into stone. The woman who had once loved Agamemnon, who had borne him children and managed his household and supported his ambitions, died with her daughter that day. What remained was something far more dangerous: a mother driven mad by grief and an insatiable hunger for revenge. For 10 long years, while Agamemnon was at Troy winning glory and taking concubines, Clytemnestra planned her revenge. She was not content to simply kill her husband quickly. She wanted him to suffer as she had suffered, to feel the betrayal as deeply as she had felt it. She took a lover, Aegisthus, who had his own reasons for hating Agamemnon. Together, they plotted not just murder, but the complete destruction of everything Agamemnon held dear. The psychological complexity of Clytemnestra's revenge is staggering. She had to maintain the facade of a faithful wife for 10 years, greeting Agamemnon's messengers with appropriate concern, managing his estates with proper care, all while nurturing a rage that burned like a forge in her heart. She had to watch her surviving children, Electra and Orestes, grow up knowing that she was planning to murder their father. She had to live every day with the knowledge that her first act of motherhood upon Agamemnon's return would be to make her children orphans. When Agamemnon finally returned from Troy, victorious and laden with spoils, Clytemnestra was ready. She greeted him with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a conquering hero. She laid out purple tapestries for him to walk on, a symbol of divine honor that should have warned him of what was coming. She welcomed him home with kisses and tears, playing the role of the devoted wife so perfectly that even Agamemnon, who had learned to be suspicious of everyone at Troy, suspected nothing. But Clytemnestra's revenge was not just about killing Agamemnon. It was about making him understand why he had to die. She waited until he was in his bath, naked and defenseless, before she struck. As she brought the axe down on his head, she reminded him of Iphigenia, of the daughter he had sacrificed for his ambition. She told him that his death was payment for their child's life, that the blood now flowing from his wounds was the same blood that had flowed from Iphigenia's throat. The murder of Agamemnon was not a crime of passion, but a carefully planned execution. Clytemnestra had thought through every detail, every possible consequence. She knew that killing the king would make her a regicide, that murdering her husband would make her a monster in the eyes of society. But she also knew that some crimes are so heinous that they can only be answered with more crime, that some betrayals cut so deep that they can only be healed with blood. But Clytemnestra's revenge came at a terrible price. In killing Agamemnon, she had not just murdered her husband, she had traumatized her children. Electra, who had worshipped her father despite his flaws, was now orphaned by her mother's hand. Orestes, still a boy, was forced to flee into exile to escape his mother's wrath. The family that had already been shattered by Iphigenia's death was now completely destroyed. The cycle of revenge that had begun with Iphigenia's sacrifice was far from over. Electra, consumed by grief and rage, spent years plotting her mother's death. She mourned her father openly, refusing to accept Clytemnestra's rule or acknowledge Aegisthus as her stepfather. She prayed daily for Orestes' return, for the day when her brother would come home and restore their father's honor by killing the woman who had murdered him. When Orestes finally returned, he faced the same impossible choice that had destroyed his family for generations. The gods themselves, speaking through the oracle at Delphi, had commanded him to kill his mother. If he obeyed, he would be committing matricide, the most horrible crime in Greek law. If he refused, he would be disobeying the gods and dishonoring his father's memory. The psychological torture of this choice is almost unbearable to contemplate. Orestes loved his mother, despite everything she had done. He could remember her, singing him lullabies, holding him when he was sick, teaching him to walk and talk and read. The woman he was being commanded to kill was not just his father's murderer, but the woman who had given him life and raised him with love. But the gods had spoken, and in the Greek world, divine commands could not be disobeyed. With encouragement and the gods' demands ringing in his ears, Orestes killed his mother. The moment his sword pierced her heart, the cycle of revenge claimed another victim, and the curse of the house of Atreus reached its crescendo. The Furies, ancient goddesses of vengeance, immediately descended upon Orestes. These were not the beautiful, rational Olympian deities, but primordial forces of justice and retribution. They appeared as hideous hags with snakes for hair, eyes that wept blood, and breath that reeked of decay. They pursued Orestes relentlessly, driving him to the edge of madness with their constant accusations and threats. The psychological horror of the Furies. Persecution was that they represented Orestes' own guilt made manifest. They were the voice of his conscience, the part of his mind that knew he had committed an unforgivable crime. No matter where he ran, no matter how far he traveled, they followed him, reminding him that he was a matricide, that he had killed the woman who had given him life. Electra, who had pushed her brother to commit this crime, found no satisfaction in their mother's death. The revenge she had craved for so long tasted like ashes in her mouth. She had gotten what she wanted, but the price was the destruction of her family and the madness of her beloved brother. The cycle of revenge had consumed everyone she loved, leaving her alone with the bitter knowledge that justice and vengeance were not the same thing. The story of the House of Atreus reveals the fundamental truth about revenge. It never ends. Each act of vengeance creates new victims, new grievances, new reasons for retribution. Iphigenia's death led to Agamemnon's murder, which led to Clytemnestra's death, which led to Orestes' madness. The curse that began with Tantalus's crime against the gods had claimed victim after victim, turning family members into murderers and love into hatred. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this cycle is how it particularly devastated the women. Of the family, Iphigenia died as an innocent victim. Clytemnestra was transformed from a loving mother into a vengeful murderer. Electra was consumed by hatred and rage. Each woman was destroyed by the violence of the men around them, but they were also complicit in perpetuating that violence, passing trauma and hatred from one generation to the next. The women of the House of Atreus were not passive victims. They were active participants in their own destruction. Clytemnestra chose revenge over forgiveness. Electra chose hatred over healing, and both choices led to greater suffering for everyone involved. The curse of their bloodline was not just about divine punishment, but about the human capacity for turning pain into more pain, for allowing trauma to corrupt natural bonds of love and loyalty. Chapter 5. The Fury of Goddesses. Even the most powerful. Women in Greek mythology, the goddesses themselves, were not immune to suffering and humiliation. Their stories reveal that divine power could not protect them from the fundamental inequalities and injustices that characterized the Greek cosmos. If anything, their immortality made their suffering more profound, ensuring that their pain would last forever. Hera, queen of the gods and goddess of marriage, should have been the most powerful woman in the universe. She was Zeus's wife, sister to Poseidon and Hades, ruler of the heavens alongside her husband. But her marriage was a constant source of torment, a never-ending cycle of betrayal and humiliation that would have destroyed a mortal woman. Zeus was perhaps the most unfaithful husband in all of mythology. He pursued goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women with equal enthusiasm, caring nothing for his wife's feelings or his marriage vows. He raped, seduced, and abandoned women by the dozens, fathering children with them and then leaving them to face Hera's wrath alone. The king of the gods treated his sacred marriage as a joke, his wife as an inconvenience to be ignored or deceived. But Hera could not divorce Zeus, could not leave him, could not even truly punish him for his infidelities. Divine marriage was eternal, and Zeus was too powerful to be challenged directly. So Hera's rage turned outward, toward the women who had attracted her husband's attention. She became the archetypal jealous wife, punishing the victims of her husband's crimes while leaving the perpetrator untouched. The psychological profile of Hera's revenge reveals a woman driven to madness by powerlessness and betrayal. She could not hurt Zeus directly, so she hurt everyone connected to him. She transformed Io into a cow, drove Leto to the edges of the earth while she was pregnant with Apollo and Artemis, and sent snakes to kill the infant Hercules in his cradle. She turned her divine power into an instrument of cruelty, using her immortal strength to torment mortals, who had no power to resist her. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Hera's story is how it reflected the reality of marriage in ancient Greece. Like mortal wives, Hera was expected to remain faithful while her husband pursued other women. Like mortal wives, she was blamed for her husband's infidelities, as if Zeus's wandering eye was somehow her fault. Like mortal wives, she was expected to channel her anger toward other women rather than toward the man who had betrayed her. Hera's suffering was compounded by the fact that she was the goddess of marriage itself. Her very identity was bound up with the institution that brought her nothing but pain. She was supposed to protect other women's marriages while her own was a source of constant humiliation. She was expected to bless other couples with happiness while her own relationship was poisoned by betrayal and resentment. The story of Demeter and Persephone reveals another dimension of how even goddesses could be victimized by the male power. Structure of Olympus. Demeter, goddess of the harvest and fertility, was a loving mother who doted on her daughter Persephone. The two were inseparable, spending their days together in fields and meadows, bringing life and growth to the world through their combined power. But Hades, god of the underworld, decided that he wanted Persephone as his wife. He did not court her, did not ask for her consent, did not even inform her mother of his intentions. Instead, he waited until Persephone was alone in a field, picking flowers, and then he struck. The earth opened beneath her feet, and Hades dragged her down to his dark kingdom, where she would be trapped forever as queen of the dead. The rape of Persephone was not just a crime against the young goddess, but a violation of the natural order itself. Demeter's grief was so profound that she withdrew her blessing from the earth, causing all plants to wither and die. Crops failed, trees lost their leaves, and the world began to slide toward permanent winter. The goddess, who had once brought life to everything she touched, now brought only death and desolation. Zeus, faced with the prospect of humanity starving to death, was forced to intervene. But even his solution revealed the casual cruelty of the male gods toward women. He negotiated a compromise that would force Persephone to spend part of each year in the underworld with her rapist. She would be allowed to return to her mother for spring and summer, but she would have to go back to Hades for autumn and winter, reliving her trauma every year for eternity. The psychological horror of this arrangement cannot be overstated. Persephone was condemned to spend half of each year with the man who had raped her, to share his bed and his throne, to pretend to be his willing wife while her soul died a little more each day. She was not rescued from her situation, but forced to accept it as the price of preventing humanity's extinction. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Persephone myth is how it has been romanticized over the centuries. Modern retellings often portray Hades as a misunderstood romantic hero, and Persephone as a willing bride who chose to stay in the underworld. These versions strip away the horror of the original myth, turning a story about rape and trauma into a love story about destiny and choice. The original myth knew better. It understood that Persephone's annual return to the underworld was not romantic, but tragic. Demeter's grief each autumn the death of the natural world each winter. These were not celebrations of love, but lamentations for a daughter who could never truly be free. The changing seasons were not symbols of renewal, but reminders of perpetual loss. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, presents a different but equally disturbing picture of divine womanhood. She was born from Zeus's head, springing fully formed from her father's skull after he had swallowed her pregnant mother, Metis. This bizarre birth story was the Greeks' way of explaining how a goddess could be both female and completely loyal to the patriarchal order. Athena was a virgin goddess who rejected all romantic and sexual relationships, dedicating herself entirely to warfare and wisdom. She was the ultimate daddy's girl, supporting Zeus in all his decisions and never questioning his authority. She was powerful, respected, and feared, but she achieved this status by completely rejecting her own femininity and identifying entirely with masculine values. The price of Athena's power was the suppression of everything that made her a woman. She could not love, could not marry, could not have children, could not even sympathize with other women who were victimized by the male gods. When Medusa was raped in her temple, Athena punished the victim rather than the perpetrator. When Hera challenged her to a weaving contest and produced work that was technically superior, Athena destroyed the girl's work and transformed her into a spider. Athena's story reveals how women in Greek mythology could achieve power and respect, but only by completely rejecting their femininity and becoming honorary men. She was allowed to be strong and intelligent because she posed no threat to male authority, because she had no interest in love or family or any of the things that made women dangerous to the patriarchal order. But even Athena's power was limited and conditional. She was wise, but Zeus was wiser. She was a warrior, but she fought only the battles that Zeus approved. She was a virgin, but her chastity was not her own choice. It was a requirement of her position. She had achieved everything a woman could achieve in the Greek cosmos, but she had done so by ceasing to be a woman in any meaningful sense. The stories of Hera, Demeter, and Athena reveal the fundamental truth about divine womanhood in Greek mythology. Even goddesses were subject to the same patriarchal constraints that limited mortal women. They could be powerful, but only within narrow parameters. They could be respected, but only if they accepted their subordinate position. They could be free, but only if they gave up everything that made them female. The tragedy of these divine women is that their immortality ensured that their suffering would never end. Hera would be betrayed by Zeus for eternity. Demeter would lose Persephone every winter for as long as the world existed. Athena would remain forever virgin, forever isolated, forever cut off from the full experience of womanhood. Their divine status, which should have protected them from the worst aspects of female existence, instead ensured that they would endure those aspects forever. Chapter 6. The Spoils of War, the Trojan War. That great conflict that obsessed the Greek imagination for centuries was not just a war between armies, but a war against women. The female casualties of this conflict were not collateral damage, but specific targets. Women whose lives were systematically destroyed by the machinery of male violence and ambition. The war itself began with the abduction of Helen, but it would end with the enslavement, rape, and murder of countless other women whose only crime was being born in the wrong city at the wrong time. The fall of Troy was not just a military victory, but a systematic campaign of gender-based violence that would serve as a template for countless future conflicts. Andromache, wife of Hector, was perhaps the most tragic figure among the Trojan women. She had everything to lose: a husband she adored, a baby son who represented the future of her family, and a position as Princess of Troy that gave her life meaning and purpose. But the war took everything from her, piece by piece, until she was left with nothing but memories and grief. The death of Hector, Troy's greatest warrior and Andromache's beloved husband, was the beginning of her torment. She watched from the walls of Troy as Achilles dragged her husband's body behind his chariot, defiling the corpse of the man she loved. The Greeks' treatment of Hector's body was not just disrespectful, it was a deliberate psychological torture aimed at breaking the spirit of the Trojan people. But losing her husband was only the beginning of Andromache's suffering. After Troy fell, she was forced to watch as her infant son, Astyanax, was torn from her arms and thrown from the walls of the city. The Greeks had decided that no male heir of the Trojan royal family could be allowed to live, lest he grow up to seek revenge for his city's destruction. So they murdered a baby, and they made his mother watch. The psychological horror of this moment cannot be overstated. Andromache had already lost her husband, her city, and her freedom. Now she lost her child, the one thing that had given her hope for the future. The Greeks didn't just kill Astyanax, they made his death as traumatic as possible for his mother, ensuring that she would carry the image of his murder with her for the rest of her life. After the murder of her son, Andromache was enslaved and given to Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, as his concubine. She was forced to serve the son of the man who had killed her husband, to share his bed and bear his children, to pretend gratitude for the small mercies of her new life. The woman who had once been a princess, who had commanded servants and lived in luxury, was now a slave whose only value was her ability to provide sexual pleasure to her master. The psychological complexity of Andromache's situation is staggering. She had to find a way to survive in a world that had taken everything from her, to continue living when death might have been a mercy. She had to serve her husband's killer's son with at least the appearance of willing submission, knowing that any sign of rebellion would bring swift punishment. She had to bear children to a man she hated, knowing that those children would be half-siblings to the Greek warriors who had destroyed her family. But Andromache's story was not unique. Every woman in Troy faced a similar fate when the city fell. Hecuba, the queen and mother of Hector, was forced to watch as her sons were killed and her daughters were enslaved. She had borne 50 children to Priam, and she lived to see almost all of them die violent deaths. The woman who had once been the most powerful female in Troy was reduced to a grief-stricken old woman, powerless to protect any of her children. The transformation of Hecuba from queen to slave reveals the complete vulnerability of women in the ancient world. Her power, her position, her very identity were all dependent on the men in her life. When those men were killed, she became nothing, a piece of property to be divided among the victors. The crown that had once adorned her head was replaced by the chains of slavery. Cassandra, whom we encountered earlier, faced her own unique horror during the fall of Troy. Her rape by Ajax in Athena's temple was not just a personal violation, but a symbol of how completely the Greeks had abandoned any pretense of honoring the gods or respecting sacred spaces. The woman who had spent her life serving the divine was violated in the very place where she had sought sanctuary. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Trojan women's fate was how their suffering was distributed as rewards to the Greek heroes. These women were not just enslaved, they were specifically assigned to the men who had destroyed their families. It was a calculated cruelty designed to maximize their psychological torment. Bryce is the woman who became the center of the conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon, exemplifies this pattern. She had been a queen in her own right before the war. ruling a small city near Troy. But when the Greeks captured her city, they killed her husband and brothers and enslaved her. She was given to Achilles as his prize, his reward for his prowess in battle. The famous quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon was not about Briseis's welfare or her rights as a person. It was about property rights, about which of two men owned her body. When Agamemnon was forced to give up his own concubine, Chryses, he demanded Briseis as compensation. The entire conflict that drives the plot of the Iliad is about the ownership of women's bodies, about male honor and male pride and male privilege. Briseis herself had no voice in this conflict. She was traded back and forth between the two men, like a valuable object, her feelings and preferences irrelevant to the proceedings. The men who fought over her saw her as a symbol of their status, a trophy that represented their success in war. Her humanity was invisible to them, her personhood irrelevant to their concerns. The psychological impact of this treatment on Briseis can only be imagined. She had gone from being a queen to being a prize, from commanding others to being commanded, from having her own identity to being defined entirely by her relationship to the men who owned her. She was expected to be grateful for the protection and status that came with being a hero's concubine, to find meaning in her new role as sexual servant to the man who had destroyed her previous life. But even more disturbing than the individual fates of these women was the systematic nature of their suffering. The Greeks did not accidentally end up with thousands of female slaves. They deliberately created this situation. The capture and enslavement of women was not a side effect of war, but one of its primary objectives. The heroes fought not just for glory or honor, but for the right to own and control the bodies of conquered women. The distribution of women after Troy's fall was handled with the same care and attention as the distribution of gold and weapons. The most beautiful and highest-ranking women were reserved for the most important heroes, while lesser women were assigned to lesser men. It was a systematic program of sexual slavery that reduced human beings to commodities to be bought, sold, and traded. The Greek heroes who participated in this system were not portrayed as monsters or villains, but as the greatest men of their age. Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, and the rest were celebrated for their strength, courage, and honor, while their systematic abuse of women was treated as a natural and acceptable part of their heroic status. The same men who were praised for their nobility in battle were also praised for their success in acquiring beautiful slaves. This normalization of sexual violence and slavery reveals the fundamental values of the society that created these stories. Women were not seen as people with rights and dignity, but as resources to be exploited by the men who had the power to take them. The fact that these women had once been queens and princesses, that they had once had their own lives and identities, was irrelevant to their captors. The stories of the Trojan women revealed the true cost of the war that the Greeks celebrated as their greatest victory. Yes, they had recovered Helen and restored Menelaus's honor. Yes, they had proven their military superiority and won eternal fame. But they had also systematically destroyed the lives of thousands of innocent women, creating a program of sexual slavery that would haunt the ancient world for centuries to come. The sack of Troy was not just a military victory, but a template for how conquering armies should treat the women of defeated cities. The precedent set by the Greek heroes would be followed by countless future conquerors, each one justifying their own crimes by pointing to the example of the men who had destroyed Troy. Chapter 7. The Price of Beauty in the Cosmos of Greek Mythology. Beauty was not a blessing but a curse, a divine gift that invariably led to suffering and destruction. The most beautiful women in these stories were not rewarded for their looks, but punished for them, as if their very existence was an affront to the natural order that demanded violent correction. Helen of Troy, whose face launched 1,000 ships, was perhaps the most beautiful woman who ever lived. But her beauty was not her own. It was a gift from Aphrodite, goddess of love, who had won her in a divine beauty contest judged by the Trojan prince Paris. Helen's beauty was a weapon in the hands of the gods, a tool used to manipulate mortal men and trigger the greatest war in mythological history. But what was it like to be Helen? What was it like to live in a body so beautiful that it drove men to madness and war? The myths give us glimpses of a woman trapped by her own perfection, unable to live a normal life because her very existence disrupted the world around her. Helen's first marriage to Menelaus was arranged not for love but for political alliance. She was a prize to be won, a trophy that would cement Menelaus's power and prestige. But her beauty made her a target for every ambitious man in Greece. When Paris arrived in Sparta, he saw Helen not as a person, but as an opportunity, a way to gain the most beautiful woman in the world for himself. The abduction of Helen, whether it was rape or seduction, was the inevitable result of treating women as objects to be possessed. Helen's feelings, her desires, her own choices were irrelevant. To the men who fought over her, she was reduced to a symbol, a cause for war, a beautiful face that represented everything worth fighting for. During the 10 years of the Trojan War, Helen lived in Troy as Paris's wife, but she was also a prisoner of her own beauty. The Trojan people resented her presence, knowing that she was the cause of their suffering. Every death in the war, every burned building, every starving child was blamed on the woman whose beauty had started it all. She was simultaneously the most honored and most hated woman in Troy. The psychological torment of Helen's situation is almost impossible to imagine. She was trapped in a city under siege, surrounded by people who blamed her for their suffering. Married to a man who saw her as a trophy rather than a person. She had no friends, no allies, no one who cared about her feelings or her happiness. Her beauty, which should have been a source of joy and pride, had become a source of isolation and despair. But Helen's story was not unique. The pattern of beautiful women being punished for their beauty appears throughout Greek mythology with disturbing frequency. Leda, Helen's mother, was raped by Zeus in the form of a swan. Europa was abducted by Zeus in the form of a bull. Danae was imprisoned by her father and then raped by Zeus in the form of golden rain. In each case, the woman's beauty attracted divine attention, and divine attention always meant suffering. The story of Psyche reveals another dimension of how beauty could become a curse. Psyche was so beautiful that people stopped worshipping Aphrodite and began worshipping her instead. The goddess of love, jealous of a mortal woman's beauty, sent her son Eros to make Psyche fall in love with a monster. But Eros himself fell in love with Psyche, beginning a romance that would put the mortal woman through a series of trials and tribulations that nearly killed her. Psyche's beauty had made her a rival to a goddess, and goddesses did not tolerate rivals. The fact that Psyche had done nothing to encourage worship, that she was an innocent victim of other people's admiration, was irrelevant to Aphrodite's rage. The goddess saw Psyche's beauty as a personal insult, a challenge to her own divine authority that had to be crushed. The trials that Aphrodite imposed on Psyche were designed to be impossible, to break her spirit and destroy her body. She was forced to sort a room full of mixed grains, to gather wool from vicious sheep. to fetch water from a deadly river, and finally to journey to the underworld and back. Each task was intended to kill her, to remove the threat that her beauty posed to Aphrodite's supremacy. But even when Psyche succeeded in completing these impossible tasks, even when she proved her worth through suffering and sacrifice, she was still punished for her beauty. The box of beauty that she brought back from the underworld contained not cosmetics, but a deadly sleep, a trap that Aphrodite had set for her mortal rival. Only the intervention of Eros saved Psyche from death, and even then, her transformation into a goddess was as much a prison as a reward. The message of these stories is clear. Beauty is dangerous, especially for women. It attracts unwanted attention, provokes jealousy and violence, and ultimately leads to suffering and death. The most beautiful women in Greek mythology were not the most fortunate, but the most tragic, their lives destroyed by the very quality that should have brought them joy. This theme reflects the deep anxieties of Greek society about female beauty and its power to disrupt social order. Beautiful women were seen as inherently dangerous, their looks a form of magic that could drive men to madness and war. The myths served as warnings about the power of beauty, but they also served as justifications for controlling and punishing. Beautiful women. The story of Pandora, the first woman, reveals how the Greeks connected female beauty with the introduction of evil into the world. Pandora was created by the gods as a punishment for humanity, a beautiful curse designed to bring suffering and death to mortal men. Her beauty was a trap, a lure that would lead men to their doom. Pandora's famous box was not just a container of evils, but a symbol of female sexuality and its supposed dangers. The myth suggested that women's bodies were like boxes that contained horrors, that female beauty was a deception that hid corruption and decay. The first woman was not a companion or helpmate for men, but a weapon designed to destroy them. The psychological impact of these stories on actual women can only be imagined. They lived in a culture that told them their beauty was dangerous, that their very existence was a threat to social order, that they were responsible for the chaos and violence that their looks provoked. They were blamed for the crimes committed against them, held responsible for the uncontrolled desires of the men who saw them. Beautiful women in ancient Greece faced an impossible choice. They could try to hide their beauty and live lives of deliberate self-diminishment, or they could embrace their looks and accept the violence and suffering that would inevitably follow. Either way, they were trapped by a system that saw female beauty as inherently problematic, a force that needed to be controlled or destroyed. The myths of beautiful women served as both warning and justification for this system. They warned women about the dangers of being too attractive, but they also justified the punishment of women who were beautiful. If Helen's beauty caused the Trojan War, then beautiful women were responsible for the chaos they provoked. If Pandora's beauty hid a box of evils, then beautiful women were inherently deceptive and dangerous. These stories created a cultural narrative that blamed women for male violence, that held them responsible for the uncontrolled desires of men. They normalized the punishment of beauty, making it seem natural and inevitable that attractive women would suffer for their looks. They created a world where beauty was not a gift but a curse, where the most blessed women were also the most doomed. The legacy of these myths extends far beyond ancient Greece. The idea that beautiful women are inherently dangerous, that they provoke violence through their mere existence, that they are responsible for the chaos they inspire, continues to shape our culture today. The victim blaming that runs through these ancient stories can still be heard in modern discussions of sexual violence and harassment. Helen's face may have launched 1,000 ships, but it also launched 1,000 years of stories that blamed women for male violence, that held them responsible for the uncontrolled desires of men, that turned beauty from a blessing into a curse. The most beautiful women in Greek mythology were not the most fortunate, but the most tragic, their lives destroyed by the very quality that should have brought them joy and fulfillment. Chapter 8: The Maternal Sacrifice. The role of motherhood in Greek mythology was not one of honor and protection, but of inevitable loss and sacrifice. Mothers in these stories were not celebrated for their nurturing and care, but punished for their love, forced to watch their children die or be taken from them, their maternal instincts twisted into instruments of torture. Niobe, Queen of Thebes, was perhaps the most tragic mother in all of Greek mythology. She had been blessed with 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, all beautiful and talented and beloved. She was proud of her fertility, proud of her success as a mother, and in her pride, she made a fatal mistake. She boasted that she was better than Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, because she had more children. This boast was not just vanity, but a challenge to the gods themselves. Leto, despite being a goddess, had only 2 children, twins who had been born after she had wandered the earth, seeking a place to give birth. Hera, jealous of Zeus's affair with Leto, had forbidden any land from sheltering the pregnant goddess. When Niobe claimed superiority over Leto, she was claiming superiority over the divine order itself. The punishment was swift and merciless. Apollo and Artemis, the twin children of Leto, descended upon Thebes with their bows and arrows. They hunted Niobe's children like animals, shooting them down one by one while their mother watched in horror. The boys were killed first, shot down while they were exercising in the gymnasium. Then the girls were murdered, some while they were weaving, others while they were playing. Niobe tried to shield her youngest daughter, holding the girl against her body and begging the gods for mercy. But even this last child was torn from her, arms and killed, leaving Niobe surrounded by the corpses of her 14 children. The woman who had boasted of her fertility was left with nothing but grief and the memory of her dead children. The transformation of Niobe into stone was not just a physical change, but a psychological one. She had loved her children so much that their death left her unable to function as a human being. She became a monument to maternal grief, a stone figure that wept eternal tears for the children she had lost. Her love had been so strong that it survived even her transformation, manifesting as the constant flow of water from the rock that she had become. The story of Niobe reveals the fundamental vulnerability of mothers in the Greek worldview. Their love for their children was seen as a weakness that could be exploited, a point of leverage that the gods could use to inflict maximum suffering. The deeper a mother's love, the more she could be hurt by threats to her children. This pattern appears throughout Greek mythology with disturbing frequency. Hecuba, Queen of Troy, was forced to watch as her sons were killed and her daughters enslaved. She had borne 50 children to Priam, and she lived to see almost all of them die violent deaths. The woman who had once been the most successful mother in Troy was reduced to a grief-stricken old woman, powerless to protect any of her children. The psychological torture of Hecuba's situation was that she could see disaster coming but was powerless to prevent it. She watched as her son Hector rode out to face Achilles, knowing that he would not return. She saw her daughter Cassandra's prophecies dismissed as madness, knowing that every word was true. She lived through the fall of Troy with the terrible knowledge that her family was doomed. that her children would die and her daughters would be enslaved. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Hecuba's story is how her grief transformed her into a monster. After watching her family destroyed, after seeing her youngest son Polydorus murdered by a supposed ally, Hecuba finally snapped. She lured the murderer to her tent and tore out his eyes with her bare hands, transforming from a grieving mother into an avenging fury. The transformation of Hecuba from queen to monster was not just a physical change, but a psychological one. The woman who had once been known for her wisdom and dignity was driven to savage revenge by the loss of her children. Her love had been so corrupted by grief that it turned into hatred. Her maternal instincts twisted into instruments of violence. The story of Procne and Philomela reveals another dimension of how motherhood could be corrupted by violence and revenge. Procne had married Tereus, king of Thrace, and borne him a son named Eetus. But when Tereus raped Procne's sister, Philomela, and cut out her tongue to prevent her from telling anyone, Procne's maternal love was transformed into a desire for revenge, so powerful that it overcame her natural maternal instincts. The revenge that Procne chose was the most horrific imaginable. She killed her own son and served his flesh to his father as a meal. The woman who had once nursed Eetus at her breast now cooked his body and fed it to the man who had violated her sister. Her love for her child was overwhelmed by her need for revenge, her maternal instincts corrupted by the violence that had been done to her family. The psychological complexity of Procne's choice is staggering. She had to overcome every natural instinct, every maternal bond, every memory of love and care to kill her own child. But she also had to live with the knowledge that there was no other way to make Tereus understand the magnitude of his crime. The rape of her sister had been so heinous that it could only be answered with an equally heinous act. The transformation of Procne, Philomela, and Tereus into birds was not just a physical change, but a symbolic one. They had all been so dehumanized by violence that they could no longer exist as people. Procne became a nightingale, forever singing laments for the son she had killed. Philomela became a swallow, forever trying to tell her story with a voice that had been stolen from her. Tereus became a hoopoe, forever pursuing the women he had wronged. These stories reveal the fundamental truth about motherhood in Greek mythology. It was not a source of power or protection, but of vulnerability and suffering. Mothers were not honored for their love, but punished for it, their maternal instincts twisted into instruments of torture. The deeper their love, the more they could be hurt by threats to their children. The goddess Demeter, whom we encountered earlier, exemplifies this pattern on a divine scale. Her love for her daughter Persephone was so strong that it literally controlled the seasons, bringing life to the earth when they were together, and death when they were apart. But this love also made her vulnerable to Zeus's cruel bargain, forcing her to accept her daughter's annual return to the underworld.